In 1923, Germany didn't just experience high inflation. It experienced a complete monetary collapse, so fast, so total, that money stopped behaving like money. Prices didn't rise by the month or the week, they rose by the hour. Paychecks were spent the moment they arrived. Savings accounts became souvenirs. And the basic trust that holds a society together, trust in contracts, wages, and tomorrow, began to evaporate. This is the story of the day money died. Not in a single explosion, but in a chain reaction. War finance, political paralysis, reparations, occupation, and one fatal tool that felt like an easy fix: the printing press. To understand why 1923 happened, you have to start earlier, with a country coming out of the First World War. Germany entered the war in 1914 with an economy tied to gold and a currency the world recognized. But wars are paid for in real time, and governments rarely want to tell citizens what war truly costs. The cleanest way to pay is taxes. The easiest way to pay is debt. Germany chose debt, massive borrowing, under the assumption it would win, and that the defeated would cover the bill. Germany did not win. When the war ended, the new Weimar Republic inherited a broken economy, political chaos, and a fiscal problem that was not merely large, but structurally dangerous. The state had obligations it could not shrink quickly: veteran support, public wages, reconstruction, basic administration. It also had debt from wartime borrowing. And then came the Versailles Treaty, reparations demanded by the Allies, payable in hard currency or goods. Hard currency was the problem. A government can always create more of its own money. It cannot print British pounds, US dollars, or gold. If a country must pay external obligations in a currency it cannot create, it faces an ugly choice: raise taxes sharply, cut spending brutally, default, or weaken its currency to make domestic resources cheaper, so exports rise and foreign currency flows in. Germany tried to avoid the political pain. Taxes were raised, but not enough. Spending was cut, but not enough. Borrowing continued, and as the mark weakened, the temptation grew. If you can't collect enough revenue, you can finance deficits by issuing money. At first, it doesn't look like catastrophe. It looks like relief. When a government prints money, it can pay salaries, keep trains running, subsidize food, and meet obligations. Today, the public sees services continue. The bureaucracy functions. The crisis appears managed. But printing money is not wealth creation. It is a transfer of value. And it only works while people still believe the paper they're receiving will hold purchasing power tomorrow. That belief is the fragile center of the story. If you want more real stories about crises, money, and power, follow the channel. By the early 1920s, Germany's currency was already under pressure. The mark had been weakening for years. Imports became expensive. Prices rose. People complained, but life continued. Then 1923 arrived, and with it a collision of politics and economics that turned a slow burn into a firestorm. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr region, Germany's industrial heartland, after Germany fell behind on reparations deliveries. The Ruhr was not symbolic. It was coal, steel, factories, railways. It was output. It was tax revenue. It was the engine room. Germany's government responded with passive resistance. Workers were encouraged to strike and refuse cooperation with the occupiers. The intention was political. The effect was economic. Production collapsed. Revenues collapsed with it. And the government made a fateful promise: it would still pay the workers. So wages went out, but goods did not come back. This is a key mechanism in hyperinflation. Money chases a shrinking supply of real stuff. If you increase the number of currency units while the economy's output is falling, prices don't merely rise, they can detach from reality. The government financed passive resistance by printing money at accelerating speed. Each month, more money had to be printed to cover the same bills because prices were higher. But those higher prices were themselves driven by the new money. The system becomes a loop. Print to pay, prices rise, print more to pay again. At the same time, the mark's exchange rate collapsed, And the exchange rate mattered because Germany needed imports: food, raw materials, industrial inputs, and those imports were priced in foreign currency. As the mark fell against the dollar and the pound, every imported item became more expensive in marks. That fed domestic inflation, which weakened the mark further, which fed inflation again. This is the second loop: currency collapse and domestic prices reinforcing each other. But there's a third loop, the most deadly one, and it has to do with psychology. Inflation isn't only a math problem, it's a trust problem. When people expect prices to rise, they stop holding money. They spend it as fast as possible. Businesses, expecting their replacement cost to rise, raise prices faster and more often. Workers demand higher wages more frequently. If wages are paid weekly, it becomes daily. If daily, it becomes twice a day. The speed at which money circulates, how quickly it is spent, explodes. Even if the government printed the same amount as yesterday, money would lose value faster simply because nobody wants to hold it. Once that behavioral shift happens, the currency can disintegrate with breathtaking speed. In 1923 Germany, the disintegration became visible in ordinary life. A loaf of bread that cost a few hundred marks could cost thousands, then millions, then billions. Prices were rewritten so often that shopkeepers stopped printing menus. Some used chalkboards. Some simply announced prices at the moment of sale. People rushed to spend wages immediately, not because they were irresponsible, but because saving became irrational. By mid-1923, money had turned into a perishable commodity. Factories began paying workers with cash at lunch so they could run to markets before prices rose again in the afternoon. Families sent children to stand in line while a parent raced to find something, anything, to trade the paycheck for before it lost more value. The images became surreal: wheelbarrows of banknotes, stacks of bills used for heating because paper was cheaper than firewood, children playing with bundles of currency like building blocks. Not because Germans had become rich, but because the unit of account had become meaningless. And when the unit of account becomes meaningless, everything built on it begins to break. Savings were wiped out first. People who had done everything right, who had saved for retirement, who kept cash reserves, who held government bonds, found their prudence punished. The middle class, which often anchors stability, felt betrayed. Fixed incomes became a trap. Pensions paid in marks turned into starvation allowances. Rent controls meant landlords received payments that no longer covered basic maintenance, so housing deteriorated. Contracts became impossible to honor. Debts became jokes. If you owed money, you could repay it with a fraction of a paycheck. That sounds like a win for debtors until you realize what happens next. Lenders stop lending, markets stop trusting, and the system that funds production and trade begins to freeze. Meanwhile, those with access to real assets adapted. If you owned foreign currency, goods, property, or businesses that could adjust prices quickly, you had protection. Large firms sometimes benefited because they could borrow in marks and repay later with worthless currency, while their assets, factories, inventory, retained real value. Workers and small savers did not have that option. This is how hyperinflation doesn't just destroy money. It reshapes society. It shifts wealth violently and unpredictably, often upward and sideways rather than simply down. It rewards proximity to assets and punishes reliance on wages and savings. Another strange phenomenon spread across Germany: not Geld, emergency money. Cities, companies, and local authorities issued their own notes to keep transactions functioning. In a normal system, that would be illegal or absurd. In 1923, it was survival. Barter returned. People traded goods directly: coal, bread, fabric, cigarettes, alcohol. In some places, foreign currency quietly replaced the mark as the real reference point. The economy became fragmented into pockets of trust. And through all of it, the government faced the same brutal arithmetic. If it printed less, it risked unrest and collapse of public services. If it printed more, it destroyed the currency faster. Every day became a narrower bridge. So why didn't they simply stop printing? Because stopping printing doesn't stop the problem instantly. It reveals the full pain all at once. If a government that has been funding itself by printing suddenly stops, it must immediately replace that financing with taxes or spending cuts or default. But in a society already on edge, raising taxes sharply and cutting wages can spark political violence. Weimar Germany in 1923 was not calm. It was fractured. Uprisings on the left, coup attempts on the right, separatist pressures, and constant fear that the republic itself might not survive. Hyperinflation is often described like a natural disaster, but it is also a political crisis where every decision has a cost that can topple governments. By late 1923, the numbers stopped making sense. One of the most cited markers of the collapse is the exchange rate, from roughly 4.2 marks per US dollar before the First World War to trillions of marks per dollar by November 1923. When your currency has to be counted in trillions for a single dollar, it is no longer a measuring tool. It is noise. At that point, stabilization required something more than printing less. It required a new anchor. Germany found that anchor in a new currency, the Rentenmark. In November 1923, the government introduced the Rentenmark as a replacement unit, with a fixed conversion to the old paper marks, 1 Rentenmark for 1 trillion old marks. More importantly, the Rentenmark was tied to real assets through a system of mortgages on industrial and agricultural land. It was not fully backed by gold, but it was designed to signal constraint, an implicit promise. This new unit will not be printed without limit. But a new currency alone is not enough. You can rename a collapsing currency and still collapse again. Stabilization required a policy pivot. The state had to stop financing deficits with money creation. Passive resistance in the Ruhr was ended. Fiscal reforms tightened the budget. The central bank's behavior changed. Credibility, lost over years and shattered in months, had to be rebuilt through actions that were painful and visible. The effect was dramatic. Once people believed the currency would hold, the velocity of money fell. Once velocity fell, prices stopped racing. Once prices stabilized, trade restarted. A new equilibrium formed. It sounds clean, almost mechanical, until you remember what had already happened. Millions had been impoverished. Savings were gone. Resentment had been planted. And the moral injury was deep. People did not simply lose money. They lost the sense that effort and responsibility were rewarded. That psychological aftermath mattered. The hyperinflation of 1923 did not directly cause everything that followed in Germany, but it became a permanent scar, one that influenced politics, risk tolerance, and institutional design for generations. It shaped how Germans thought about price stability, central banking, and the dangers of financing the state through the hidden tax of inflation. And it offers a lesson that is uncomfortable precisely because it is so human. Hyperinflation is not only about numbers on a page. It is about trust evaporating faster than policy can respond. It is about a society discovering, in real time, that money is not value. Money is an agreement. As you listen, ask yourself, when did you first realize that price isn't the same thing as value? An agreement that says I will accept this paper today because I believe others will accept it tomorrow, and because I believe the institutions behind it will not betray that trust. In Germany in 1923, that agreement broke. And once it breaks, the currency can die before anyone finishes explaining why. The day money died was not a single day. It was the moment people stopped treating the mark as a store of value, then as a unit of account, and finally as money at all. By the end, the wheelbarrows were not a symbol of excess. They were a symbol of desperation, of a society trying to outrun a collapsing promise. And when you study the German hyperinflation, the most unsettling realization is this. What feels more frightening here? Rising prices or collapsing trust? The printing press was not unleashed by villains who wanted chaos. It was used by leaders trying to avoid immediate pain, trying to keep the system functioning, trying to buy time. But in economics, time bought with broken trust is the most expensive time of all. Because eventually, the bill arrives, and in 1923, Germany, the bill was paid in the currency itself.